How do Britain's ethnic minorities vote? Not as a bloc, in fascinating ways that make it ever harder to build electoral coalitions, and not how they used to. These are some of the conclusions from a huge study of ethnic minority voters by James Kanagasooriam, Chief Research Officer at research company Focal Data, who carried out the work with the think tank UK in a Changing Europe. He's also a familiar voice and face from the Today podcast. James, good morning.
Morning, all.
So massive fragmentation of this bloc. 20 years ago, ethnic minority voters generally moved as one, but no more.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, one of the potential titles of the report we called The Great Fragmentation. And basically, one of the things that we can see is that certain minority groups have drifted right, not just in terms of their voting intention, but also their values and, what they think about the size of the state. So I think in particular British Indians and British Hindus, but also British Chinese people. And then we've also seen drift to the left, I would say, particularly amongst British people of British Caribbean extraction. And what we see is actually, if you just take the 2024 election, if you exclude Liverpool, some of the safest Labour and safest Conservative areas were in minority-heavy areas. And I think that's a really extraordinary development in British politics.
Yeah, it certainly is. And is it still, just to go back to what you said there, is it still the case that British Chinese and British Hindu voters, generally speaking, lean right, whereas Black Caribbean or Muslim voters, which of course encompasses a huge range of origins, circumstances, opinions, but the latter group lean left? Is that broadly still the case?
Kind of. There's an addendum to that, which is Labour still lead at the 2024 election amongst almost all groups. It's mainly about the differences between those groups. So those of British Hindu extraction and British Chinese are actually more equal between the Conservatives and Labour, for example, the two main parties. Whereas we see huge leads of 30, 40, 50 points, depending on the subgroup, amongst other voters.
Okay, I was looking at the report. One of the most striking findings is that on the right of politics, if you're non-white, which is still obviously the vast majority in this country, you're likely to be older and not university educated. But if you're on the right of politics and you're not white, if you're white, you're likely to be older and non-university educated. But if you're not white, you're likely to be pretty well off and highly educated. And that makes it harder to build electoral coalitions.
Yeah, I call that the Rishi Sunak, Lee Anderson axis, which is not a bug, but a feature of modern day politics, which is basically this idea that the education divide simply doesn't work the same way if you're not white. So if you're white, if you have a college education, the more likely you are to be progressive or on the left. That's simply not the case. That's reversed if you're not white. And that evidence is very consistent with almost every other Western country with a degree of minority populations. So what this means is that across the world, we now see white and non-white people bringing together very different coalitions of people, which means that you have these quite awkward groups of people who are voting together.
And you also find some quite strikingly illiberal opinion amongst some minority communities. For instance, you say you were shocked, I think, by finding out that some communities, there was significantly more likelihood of people saying they don't want to live next door to someone who is a homosexual.
Yeah, we don't shy away from the difficult findings in this report, and we look at issues of integration, we look at certain opinions. We see on that specific question up to around 30% of certain subgroups of people simply don't want to live next to someone who is LGBTQ+. I think that it poses challenges for integration and about values and what Britain stands for. But in the round, Amol, we find actually that people who are white and non-white want the same things out of life and think that the same things are important.
And how do they perceive Britain?
Positively. And actually, one of the things that really came out is that actually we didn't see that much of an institutional difference between people who were white and non-white. We saw that they were similarly warm or cold towards the same institutions. We saw big support for institutions like the NHS, like the monarchy, for the rule of law, for different organisations, but we also saw they didn't like the same things. So broadly, I think the wrapper is basically there are some key differences, but they can be overplayed.
Really interesting report. Is it available to the public, James, if punters want to read it?
Yeah, it is. And I should mention, of course, I have a co-author, Sophie Stirs as well, who wrote a huge amount of the report. And I think, it is available.